There we go. All right. So, question to the team: what is the purpose of the executive summary document?
Show clients what has come up between the original design agreement up to that point.
Does anybody
Changes
remember?
made.
What's that, Jessica?
Changes made.
Yep.
Changes
The
made.
scope of work.
Changes made since the scope of work was put together. Correct.
Mhm.
Does anybody remember why we made the executive summary document? Why it exists? Nina was the only person here when the executive summary was created. So,
I have an idea.
what's your thoughts?
Clients tend to forget their decisions as the project moves along and the impact of those decisions. That's my guess.
One of the main reasons, right? Because they tend to, if it's all communicated verbally or just in terms of, oh, it's going to add cost, they don't remember that and they don't understand the impact of it as it goes along. Once you put it in writing, people remember, and then you have something in writing to reference back to at a later date.
I think my answer would be it's a good draft document to prepare the final contract. I would use it as.
It helps inform. So that's the third reason that we did it, right? So at one point in time in my project, we did drawings and a contract for free and hoped you liked it, which was great, right? I spent 2 weeks of my life putting together documents that I handed to Glenn, and Glenn said it cost too much, and then I just rolled them up and threw them away, right? Here we would spend the time going through design, get to the end of design, put a contract together, put a set of drawings together. The team would go through the whole process that they go through to get that done. We sit down in front of the client and say, remember all those things that the designer said would cost more? And they're like, yeah. We're like, well, you're not that far over budget. It's only another $20,000. The client would freak out, right? We would have to burn the contract documents down and start over again. And so the reason for the scope of work and the executive summary trail that we do is Chris, right on point to inform the client in writing of the decisions they made and the cost impact of it. And at the end of the process, to sit down with the client and say, here's the list of decisions that you've made. Here's the cost impact of it. Here's the list of decisions you still have to make, the cost impact of those. And Mr. and Mrs. Client, what do you want us to put in the contract for you? Right. So they have decisions, they have the ability to choose what they spend and what scope of work they spend money on. Right. One of our promises to our clients is that we'll let them make wise decisions on how they spend their funds. Right. The whole thing that we have, like this group of talented designers that we have in the room, is to come up with the wise decision points. Right. The team puts the dollars to them and presents them to them and say, hey, here's all the great ideas. Here's all the options. Where do you want to spend your money, Mr. Client? Right. So from a high level standpoint, it's kind of the process. So there is a scope of work template in the digital binder, and it does have a series of instructions written at the bottom of that scope of work template. You all remember this document because you use it quite frequently, right? So from an instruction standpoint, we create that initial scope of work prior to the first, and I'm going to make an edit to it here that I thought I had already made, estimate. So this doesn't get made for ballpark estimates. This gets made when this gets handed off to Denny to put the project into ProEst. That scope of work goes with it, right? We all know that. At subsequent meetings, we simply record the changes and options at the beginning of the documents. This is important because I see this done chronologically in two directions, right? The changes and the options get recorded at the beginning of the document. The last recorded set of work gets pushed down, right? So chronologically, you read it from the last page to the front page. You don't read it chronologically from the front page to the last page, right? So the decision points are at the top, the history is at the bottom.
Blog format.
Correct. Long format. Often the scope of work gets dropped off, right? That's because at some point in time, because you end up with like 19 pages.
No, I meant a blog format.
Log format.
Yeah, blog format. So current on top.
Current on top. The scope of work that's originally created does not change once it is written, right? Because that original scope of work is a marker in time, just like this first ProWest estimate is a marker in time, right? So it's a point in time to look back to. Danny did this estimate for phase 2 sign off. It's set in time. It reflected this set of drawings and it reflected this scope of work. So we always have that solid marker to look back at to see our changes. As you go through, you record the changes and the options, the decision points. Once we get to the executive summary meeting, you see that the heading changes, right? So past scope of work, we use the heading executive summary. So you see that it starts with scope of work. Once we're past scope of work and we're meeting with a client to show them options and changes, we're using the terminology executive summary. And one thing that, just to remind everyone, that sometimes gets missed, but is hugely important for a lot of clients and really smooths the process. Not only do we use executive summary at the executive summary meeting, we use the executive summary when we present contracts, right? So it gives the client a quick summary of, we talked about this at executive summary, made a bunch of decisions. Now we're at contract. Here's the summary of the decisions we made, the cost impact of them, and then they can go read the contract, right?
I have a question.
Hit me.
This is, now I'm misinterpreting this differently now. We say that the scope of work doc is a reflection of a moment in time.
Yes,
But then bullet number 4 says change heading to executive summary for that meeting. That means the scope of work has changed, and I don't think it's a change of heading. It's a new document. Because we're not like showing them the scope of work doc, because that scope of work doc is in relation to that moment in time. That might be the misinterpretation that I've had, because I've had ones with a combination. You guys have seen my million iterations of scope of work and executive summary. I don't think that's a change in heading, is it? I thought we were deleting that and only stating changes, add-ons,
You know,
cost implications.
let's look at an example.
while you're looking, I'll just throw my 2 cents in. What I thought the process would be you write the scope of work, you make a PDF of it, and then you change. Then from that point forward, it's the executive summary. Again, I prefer project history than executive summary, because executive summary is generally a short synopsis of things, and this is the opposite of that. But whatever we're going to call it, then you have a second document that is and that gets updated as you go through. The scope of work is a document that is memorialized both as a PDF and the original scope of work document that you sent out for the ProWest. And then the executive summary one keeps getting updated as needed in that format.
So let's look at an example, because it's just this is just a minor nuanced item, right? So this was Parkinson that's in production right now. Super cool dude. You'll see if I go all the way to the bottom of it, I have the original scope of work at the bottom of this document. The title has disappeared, right? But the original scope of work's at the bottom of the document, memorialized in one place as it originally was written. Right? The DA's way at the bottom.
From my understanding, we didn't give the clients.
Yeah, that's what I'm
work
saying.
document.
I concur with that statement.
So
and-
let's semantics, right? Because Parkinson never saw this. He never saw this item, right? But if you put it all in one long form document, you don't have to go search for it. I don't have to pull 2 documents up to look at it, right? I have the executive summary notes on the top. I have the scope of work on the bottom. It's one long form document.
So you only presented the initial few pages that are classified as the executive summary.
Right. These were the items that he saw.
Okay, so you're still just keeping the history, but we're only showing a certain amount. So I'm sure that somewhere upcoming on your list of things is only show the client certain pages.
Right. So all we're showing him, and I think this was the first round of changes. So the first meeting we had with him, he saw this group. And then the next meeting we had with him, he saw this group. Actually, I think this one cover sheeted the contract, if I remember correctly. Because we only had one meeting with him. So this was actually the executive summary meeting. And this was exactly, I think, what cover sheeted the contract.
So I have two questions. Why can't you show them the original scope of work? Is there anything that is proprietary or, different about that? Or two, I still think they should be, I think it's a very dangerous thing to do, is to say, we're only going to show them this half. You're going to have, I just think that's a good way to make a mistake and show something that you don't intend to show somewhere down the line. It's like a chain of emails where you keep, you finally say something in the bottom of the chain and something you didn't want to include. I think it's dangerous.
I have no preference. This is the way we built the practice. I mean, I've done it about 100 times and not done that, but it's okay. I'm okay.
But
I
not
have no
everyone is as
preference.
perfect as you are, Mark.
Yeah,
Correct.
I have
I'll
no
be
preference.
honest though, I've never seen that format before. This is the first time I've ever seen that being saved that way.
Interesting, because I do it that way every time. Ha! Fascinating.
How many times are you writing executive summaries and scope of work documents?
Scope of work, estimator, send this document on Princeton estimator,
We're just starting this process.
at subsequent meetings.
Kind of think, Andrew, we might have done something similar to that with Hartman, but the subsequent pages were not shown.
I've never seen the full scope of work saved on a document and then having to go through the process of us saying, okay, only show the client the first 2 pages and not show them the last pages. Like, we've just never had. I've never seen this format before.
And I guess for me, I kind of had the similar, I guess, understandings of the production of the scope of work and executive summary when I came in, and I guess people were trying to explain the difference to me, because I guess that the original bullet point 4 that Mark just kind of edited there about renaming it the executive summary. I guess that's the part that I guess confused me. And what I tended to do is I write the initial scope of work and I save that off as a document, kind of like what Flynn was saying. And then anytime there's a meeting and there's updates to that, that essentially is the executive summary getting kind of snapshot in that point in time for each meeting. And that's kind of what builds that executive summary through the changes. So to me, it's kind of like two separate documents. I mean, you might put it together at the end because the original scope of work is always saved as the original scope of work, and then the additional changes are recorded in this executive summary document. So I guess that's how I see it when you're talking about change the name to executive summary. That's like a completely new document to me.
Should we vote on it?
I just changed it. All right, so this also means that we'll need to create an executive summary template, right? Because this one is called scope of work template, which is not accurate. The scope of work heading on it, which would not be accurate for executive summary. So we need
We have an executive summary template.
I don't know where it's at, Ariel. I did not find it.
It's under contracts.
Okay.
Contract templates, it has its own.
Yeah.
That's the document that I've always reviewed. And I think that's what the team has used
To get the format for the scope of work, but then we've enhanced it. Chris did like the first draft, which I used for Parkinson.
So apparently I'm doing something entirely different from the rest of the team. That's kind of exciting.
Well, I guess the question is Mark, so are you, because yours is different, so are you taking the time and you're creating that document to the format that you're looking for?
No, we just always had added it to the top. So anyway, maybe I'm confused. We'll just leave it at that. How's that? All right. So Ariel, if you make a note, executive summary template that is there does not say executive summary in the heading. Can you put that heading on that template and move that template to the same place that the scope of work template resides? So that they're in the same,
So that's one of the things I wanted to ask. I've never known where the scope of work is saved.
the scope of work is saved in the digital binder.
Just in the big binder.
Should just be a loose. Let me check.
So you don't want the executive summary template in the contract templates anymore?
I believe, and of course we can vote, so we are where we are, but if we go in here, we have the digital binder. It has the scope of work template, it has 2 scope of work samples, and that scope of work resides in here. It seems logical that the executive summary would be in the same spot.
We should keep it consistent. If we start doing multiple folders, it'll confuse everyone.
Right, because then you're hunting around for that document at that point in time.
Right.
So should it have a folder that's called scope of work since you're starting like scope of work and executive summary? Because it'll stay in one folder.
I would
I'm
appreciate
I'm
hesitant
okay with it
having-
out. I'm okay with it out here myself.
Once it gets into production, a bunch of stuff gets like randomly saved in this section, so I don't know if that matters.
Yeah, I'm okay with it here myself.
The reason that Ariel just stated is what I would prefer to be in like its own sort of folder. I mean, because you can, once you start to create it, you can get rid of like the sample documents and stuff and just have what you need in there.
Let's do a new folder, label it scope of work and executive summary templates. Drag and save. But within this folder, digital.
Roger.
Okay, I know this is very difficult to do it, but typically when I compare documents, would it be nice if we had the format side by side? It's not possible. There are too many information. Maybe internally we can do it. Maybe I can use what the definition of land I used before, project history, where I personally I'm going to do that to make my life easier. Just side by side, it was design agreement all the way up to contract, side by side. That's all.
Yeah, because we're essentially saying we're gonna have 3 documents. We're gonna have a design agreement, then we have a scope of work, and then we have the executive summary document.
Correct. All right, last things on that process. I'll come back because I had. Chris, you're going to find the next conversation ironic. So there's two almost good examples here of the documents we're looking at. This is a sample scope of work that only Chris will recognize, and we'll get the irony of why I'm using it. Very nice scope of work, good sample scope of work. I saved it in the folder so that we can look at it. Chris put it together. It's probably a little overly detailed. I think Denny would vote overly detailed versus under detailed.
Yep.
But we've got our options in here, which is, clearly defined so that the estimate can be built to reflect the options that are available to the client, which is fantastic. It had the DA number in here, which was nice. So Denny knew, am I in or out? And he could raise a flag if he was in or out. It also had really nice information in it. Like these couple of paragraphs here were just fantastic. Typical exterior finishes, typical interior finishes. Nothing fancy, nothing super specific. Enough that the estimator can put the right placeholder number in place. So a really nice touch to this sample scope of work. The only flaw that I found in it, because I did this estimate, was that it did not have an HVAC narrative. that I added it when I did this to the scope of work, when I did the estimate, so we all knew what HVAC system that I guessed at when I did the estimate.
Is there a Okey-Oke in the actual scope of work template that says like MEP?
The scope of work template is thin. Denny is working on the updating the template to something more more to our liking.
Well,
Yeah,
of course, what I would say is that if you are doing drawings and you have followed the template or the checklist on the drawings, you can carry that over to the scope of work, everything included in the drawings, which includes an HVAC narrative for the first estimate. You can carry it over to the scope of work and you know, use it. And you know, that I guess I'm saying that the checklist in the drawings can be a checklist for the scope of work also.
Yeah, and to Chris's credit, the drawings were really nice. The scope of work was really nice. The one thing he missed was the HVAC narrative, right? So,
And if we have that on the 99%.
get a 99.9. Sorry, dude.
So if the revision that Denny's putting together includes what are we doing for the MEPs? Because I think there might be some discussions that are needed for plumbing, like if it's on a septic or, you know, needs a ejector pump or whatever that would be. So that would be the reminder that would be on the scope of work that could then also reflect back on, going back to what Glenn's point is the drawings checklist and just like kind of connecting all the dots together that there is a plan for each.
Yeah, so Denny, if you're developing a template for the scope of work, I guess I would say you should feel free to use those checklists as your own basis for developing your I mean, you will find some of those things not critically important. They're more design oriented that I care about, but it should serve to remind you of things like Andrew's just talking about. I hope, because of that, those checklists are pretty thorough.
Yeah, this is pretty thin. That's all that's in the template.
Right, that is pretty thin.
Yeah, the checklist is way more advanced than this is.
Yeah, I argue that we could just use not develop a new checklist, but use the existing checklists. You know, use the ones that are there. Or if that's not giving the estimator what he needs, then we should do the updates to the design checklist to include those items. Because I gotta imagine there'll just be a handful of small items, but then everybody's looking at the same checklist all the way through, and there'd be a lot of value in the continuity of that.
I'd be 100% for that. So if you go that direction, Danny, feel free to take those checklists, mark them up, and I or somebody, I will be happy to update anything that you feel like is a hole, and that's good in that checklist.
Okay.
All right.
The only thing we would probably want to do is revise them slightly in terms of maybe the title or something, because they're called first presentation checklist, second presentation checklist. They're really also first pro-est estimate checklist at the same time then. And so we should make that somehow clear.
Okay.
All right. Then the last caveat here, this was the Parkinson executive summary, and sans the scope of work being stuffed on the bottom of it. It was a really nice executive summary. Ariel, this is one of the nicest executive summary. It had just the changes, and there were a lot at this point in time, right? But it is just the changes. There's not prior scope of work written in here. So it's real easy from an estimator standpoint, a sales standpoint, and a client standpoint to see how we got from 120 to 150, which is what he signed his design agreement for, to $238,000, right? Because the line item by line item, and this added, 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 and it was very clear to him and to us what the added scopes were. It was very clear to him what his optional decision points were, so he could make those optional decision points. We made those live and on the spot, and then we did one more round of updates, which was literally, this is the decisions he chose to add to the contract. He did not take anything out. And so when he got to contract, he saw I went from 238 to 245. And the reason I did is I picked up these 3 options. So it's really easy for him to then review the contract and sign off. Right.
Okay, Joe.
And it was really nice. Ariel left the remaining options here. And the nice thing about leaving the unchosen options in place is it's clear to the client he did not choose them. Right. So when we go back contract later and we say, I thought you were doing the rooms upstairs too. Oh, here's the executive summary. If you remember, they were.
And
not
that
chosen.
actually happened at Parkinson.
And that actually happened at Parkinson. You're correct. That's correct.
The only question, my quick question I saw from a document to other document, different colors, the way we highlight, item lines like yellow, pink, green. And my son's stupid, but just in general speaking, are we using a color code system to understand? Sometimes we highlight with a specific color. Is there a reason why we have yellow versus green versus purple?
Whose comment it is?
I'm green. I dubbed myself green.
Okay.
In general, Ariel highlights in yellow, I believe, Ariel.
Right.
I
I do all my
highlighted-
corrections in green.
Yeah.
Mm,
I
think
do
Andrew tends
yellow
to
if I have
highlight his in blue.
questions, and I have blue if I feel confident.
And I know I'm in trouble when she uses red.
okay. Well, unless we put on Slack and we forget that, unless I watch this
Yeah.
video again.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
And
don't
it
really
does-
have
and
any.
it doesn't matter. You shouldn't have to choose a color. What we should say is this color represents this and that color represents that.
Well, but I might have a specific question, so I go back to yellow because yellow is where someone.
Yeah, what
That's all.
I do when I start doing the executive summary and if we have already started it and we're still reviewing it, I highlight the things like, hey, Denny, Ariel, Rudy, I've updated the executive summary. I highlighted all my changes in green. So they can just boom, go to it, review it. If anything changes or if it stays the same, then they can just delete and know that it's either in or out or updated.
Yeah, I understand. Rudy's color is purple today, so I'll get you.
Fuchsia.
I
Look,
know
I got a
it's-
question on the scope of work that you were referring to. If we can go back to the HVAC example.
Let's see if I still have it open. Yes, I do.
So let me understand the roles properly. So Chris put together the scope of work and then you played the estimator role. You noticed that there was no HVAC. So you made an assumption on HVAC and then you updated the scope of work per the new revised assumption that you made.
I went
So-
back to the DA and pulled the assumption off of the DA. The DA had a specific item on it, and I just went back to the DA and found it.
So if there is a scope of work and then that's given over to Denny, so Denny's looking at the package and he has to make some assumptions based on the scopes of work. So is it his responsibility to go review the scope of work and update the scope of work based on his assumptions, or how does that get revised to what he actually puts the estimate together for?
The way it works right now and the way it happened today with me and Frank is I'm doing the RFPs for Isabella. We do not have a scope of work for Isabella because one was never written. So I'm doing it without. And when it came to questions like, do we have natural gas going to the appliances? Or is it being changed to electric? Frank and I went and looked for the answer and we found it. We just had to go and hunt it down. Went and looked at the contract agreement and we found it there and were able to put it in. I mean, without that scope of work, you're pretty much lost. And the only way you can do this properly is not to just assume, but to reach out to those who are involved. And one place I reach out to is Mark. The other place I reach out to is all the people in sales and design, because they're the ones that are there from the get-go and talk to the customer and know exactly what's what. So I do very little assumptions on things. I go and ask questions and start looking for things.
Correct. So then let's pretend you get that data point that you need, so you update ProEst accordingly. So then ProEst and the scope of work will start drifting apart because there's still just a specific scope of work. So who goes and tidies up the scope of work to make sure that aligns with whatever data points needed to be researched in order to update ProEst?
I think that should be production. Or not production, design.
I think in that instance, I think Mark updated the actual scope of work and just notified me about it, and that remained the original scope of work, so everybody was on the same page about what the design was. And
Isn't the scope of work theoretically a fixed, this is a one-time thing, it's the scope of work, right? And I think what happened was Mark found a significant hole in this. Again, nice job, Chris, but there was this one hole. Hopefully we won't have that kind of significant hole. It'll be thorough. You get the scope of work is done, then whatever changes as you're going on, they're being updated in the drawings. The main reason you have a scope of work is that the drawings are not fully communicating the scope yet. The scope of work describes that. That in the end, the drawings are the updated scope of work, I hope.
No, I agree with you, but we know we've all ran multiple projects, and we know from experience that you don't get to the tidy package on the first try. It always takes a couple of tries to get through. And so my question is at this point, we're saying the lead designer puts together the scope of work, which is essentially the first draft of confirming the scope of work. The estimator goes and validates it. There might be holes. In this example, there's one hole. I'm sure in other examples, there may be 0 holes, but there might be 5 holes. And so my question is then who updates to ensure the congruency?
Designer, period.
Yeah.
We review these holes during the binder process
I
is
agree.
what's happening now.
So I think that's
No,
too late.
the-
Nate. I think
The whole
what,
need to be reviewed before phase 2 sign off.
Yeah,
Before
that,
phase
as soon as that hole becomes evident, oops, I forgot the MEP, HVAC, whatever it is. Go back to the scope of work. As soon as Denny points it out, answer the question, then it should get fixed right then.
All right, so in this case, I fixed it for Chris because I was in the hand sketch huddles and I wrote the design agreement with the salesperson, right? So I knew the answer, right? So I fixed it with Chris, posted it back to Chris. And I think in Denny's case, what happens is Denny's going to post back and say, hey, we had to add shelving to your scope of work. We had to, we added PVC trim to your scope of work. You had in beadboard ceilings, and they're vaulted. And then, so I think to Andrew's point, probably the loop that's not closed here is exactly what Glenn said, which is when Denny feeds back information to the lead designer, hey, we clarified scope of work. This scope of work document then should get updated to reflect that, so that the scope of work document and the estimate match.
And that's what I've generally done in the past, because Mark, I think when you reviewed my earlier scopes of work, you pointed out some of those holes, and I think that's the reason
This
why
may
I
be
try
the
to
only one I fixed, right? Just because I knew the answer, right?
Yeah, normally you post your notes on Slack. I update the scope of work and the lead, and I update the drawings as well to reflect that. And that's one of the reasons why I try to be detailed in the scope of work, because I don't know all the answers. And I don't know what you guys might input in there, what information you might have. So it's kind of like it's a first draft, and then you guys add the input that you have based upon your knowledge of things, and we talk it out, and the scope of work gets updated accordingly.
It's real
And
common.
then it's
Things
done.
like fascias and soffits need to be updated, right? Were they PVC or were they wrapped? That's a real common one, right? So I guess for us here, the closure to this is what Glenn said is Denny will have questions, he'll have clarifications. Once he does, Denny, you'll post your estimate back, you'll post your scope clarifications back. I assume this, we talked and we chose this, and then the lead designer should be responsible to come back and update that scope of work to match that estimate so that they're in alignment and that place and time is accurate.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
Goldar, Nina, Jessica? Cool, good question, Andrew. All right, that's all I got. Any other questions? We're about 5 minutes over.
So you guys or Denny, you are gonna be working or developing some sort of like template for scope of work?
Well, I was doing it for the RFPs, but I can do the scope of work as well. Not a problem.
Yeah, we were starting with RFPs and then we were gonna work our way backward to scope of work.
And going back to what Glenn had said at one point in time, we need to get that scope of work put onto the RFP, but it doesn't have to be as detailed on the RFP as it is as the scope of work document. You just got to give a brief synopsis of what this project is and what we're doing. 2-story addition with bathroom, bedroom, whatever the case happens.
In a perfect world, which Denny will get us to in about 2 weeks.
Uh-huh.
Right, you would start a scope of work conversation. You would have the RFPs and then the changes, and all of that would add up to the contract that
Right.
PD's working on, right?
Exactly.
Instead of reinventing contract language.
Yeah, you should just be able to take the main RFP report and that's your contract.
That's your contract. Short any other changes since then.
Right.
Just to clarify, the scope of work and design agreement is the same thing, am I right? No, scope of work and design agreement are the same thing. I need to ask this question, otherwise we won't know the answer.
No, design agreement, scope of work are not the same thing.
Okay. I have to ask this question. I
Yeah,
have to ask
no,
this
I mean, Mark, we use to create the scope of work.
It's a
we
starting
start
point.
with-
It's the starting point, but they are not
the
the same
same thing, but that's the starting point. That's how lead designers get their scope of work, is the download from sales in our post DA huddle. We use that. We have conversations with the client,
Right.
conversations with our clients, and then write it out.
Yeah.
So
It's a good-
not the
it's
same thing, but it's
not the same
based off
thing.
of that.
Yeah,
Right.
okay. Thank you.
And again, you know my point of view, the drawings, you will have gone left or right or up or down from the design agreement and
Absolutely.
wherever you are. So it has to be coincident with the drawings, not just a rehashing of the design agreement, because it could have easily changed in the course of
100%.
that process.
100%. All right, awesome.
Good
Thank you,
clarity.
Mark. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, thanks.
Thank you,
Thanks, everybody.
everyone. Take care.